Hi guys, welcome. We'll be adding fragments to the Android Bottombar framework. This is going to be a further implementation to the Android Bottombar framework in which we'll be learning on how to replace fragments content for each bottom bar menu, which will be independent to each other. Let's get started. Right there in Android Studio, we still have the source code of the Android Bottombar, which I actually uploaded to my GitHub, and we're actually going to be adding more implementation to this framework. Basically, we'll be adding the data subpackage where we're going to have the DB helper, the contract, and the provider. This is basically the fragrance eShop content. We actually want to display grids of fragrances right there in the, let's call it in the tab. We're going to be using the three tabs activity where we have the friends, the favorites, and the nearby. We're actually going to add just grids of tabs right there in the favorite tab, and we're actually going to be showing you on how to achieve this. Looking at the raw, we have the fragrance JSON, so we're going to be fetching data right there from this JSON file where we have the fragrance name, description, the image URL, the price, and the user rating. The price is going to be in dollars. So we're actually going to be consuming and parsing this particular JSON right there in the DB helper. So a quick look at the DB helper where we have the fragrance DB helper that extends the SQLite Open helper. So we have that set up, and we also create some fields, the SQLite database, the content resolver. If you've been watching my tutorials, you would have seen this kind of implementation in previous lessons. But for new viewers, I'll still brush down through. We call on the content resolver since we need to actually use the provider, so that's the essence of that, and also the SQLite DB object, so we get the writable database from that, so we can use the content resolver or the DB. Now we have the columns which were created right there in the contract. Quick look at the contract where we have the fragrance entry, where we have the columns, the column name, description, image, price, user rating, and possibly the item ID. We have that set up, and this is where we even set up the content URI, the base content URI. You have it right there, and the path to the fragrance. You also have the content URI itself, where you append the path, the base content URI, with the path to the fragrance. So you have that set up. Back to the DB helper, you have to execute the table, the creation of the table. That's why we have this string called right there in the execute SQL. So after that, we have the try and catch, and this try and catch actually is going to read the fragrances from the resources, passing the DB as a parameter. So we are going to actually have the method, and you need to catch for two exceptions, IO exception and the JSON exception. So those are the two exceptions we actually catch, and we print to stack trace. We have the read fragrances from resources, where we pass the SQLite database object as a parameter, and it's going to throw two exceptions as well, which is the IO exception and the JSON exception, which we actually catch right there where we call this particular method. And this is where we get to decompile and parse the JSON. We actually call the builder and the input stream, which points to the resources, the raw folder where the fragrance.json file sits, and we have the buffer reader to actually read up the streams, and we actually pass that to the build string, to the builder to string, and we have this as a raw JSON. So from here we have the keys that we needed, the fragrances, which is actually the array, and we have the fragrance name, the description, image URL, price, and user rating as we've seen, and we have to iterate through a for loop through the fragrance array by getting the length, which is going to serve as the argument, and with that we have the variables of its appropriate data type, where we have double, integer, and string, and we're actually going to get the data right from them, where we have the fragrance details as an object of the JSON object, which is actually calling from the fragrance array. With the get JSON object, this I is actually going to serve as the index, while iterated through we'll be able to get the first object, the second, third, and down to the last. So with that, we start extracting values and saving them right there in the variables we declared in there. After that, we have to call on the columns needed: name, description, image, price, the user rating, and we're going to pass in the data we actually got, and we will be putting those data right there in the SQLite database. So that's just the framework of how we actually be getting the data right from the fragrance JSON. I'll be parsing that using the buffered reader, and we're actually going to be saving that same data to the SQLite database. So we have that set up, and we have a provider which is built on top of the SQLite database to assess the CRUD implementation, the create, the read, the update, and the delete of different data right there in the SQLite database. We have for the all fragrances and the fragrance with an ID. We have to actually set up the content, the URI matcher based on the content authority, and for the path fragrance and for the all fragrances, we have for the fragrance with an ID. That's for a specific fragrance item. We need to override three methods: the query, the update, and the delete. Now for the query, we actually need to get the case: is it for all fragrances or fragrance with an ID? Of course, we are trying to fetch data from the database. So you call the database query and points to the table name, the projection, which serves as the column, and the selection, if there's any selection column you needed, and its argument, and also if there's any sort order. So you pass them into this query. We have for the fragrance with an ID, and the cursor set notification, get context, get content resolver, passing the URI is very important. This makes changes, and it's actually going to update the cursor appropriately and show immediately the query ran. So it's actually going to show this to the UI. So that's the essence of that. And we have for the insert, when we are inserting to the DB. So if the case is fragrances, definitely we setting all, and we have this insert fragrances. That this a method which we have, a private method which we have right there. It's a URI method, and passing two parameters, URI and content values. So we have that set up outside the insert method, and this is actually going to get the writable database from the fragrance DB helper, and from there you can use the database object to insert into the table. So you have that set up. The same thing goes with the delete, but we basically need the query and the insert, which we've talked about. So without much digression, we need to fall back to our bottom bar. Now let's get to know how to inflate the fragments which we actually needed to display this data on. Right there in the main activity, we have the view set up this way. The three tabs is calling the tabs activity. We have buttons, like up to 5 buttons that are actually calling different forms of bottom bar. We're actually going to be using this implementation on just one of it, which is the three tabs activity. So right there in the three tabs activity, we'll be heading straight to that, which we have here set up, which extends the app compact activity. And now we're going to talk vividly on how to actually use the bottom bar ID. So let's get to look at this closely. We set the title, fine. We set the content view, which is the layout, the activity three tabs. Now let's get to look at this. On set on tab select listener, which actually called the new on tab select listener, and override the on tab selected. So when a tab has been selected, it points down to an ID, which is a parameter needed. Now this is the same ID you're going to use to test for different tabs. Click. We're going little further to our layout. Let's get to look at the layout. the three tabs, we have it set out to, yeah, cool. Let me take this away. Actually not using a toolbar. So now, if we should notice, in the bottom bar library, we have the tab XML resource, calling the XML the bottom bar tabs, the bottom bar tabs. Now let's get to look at that particular XML. Very important. Right there in the XML folder, the bottom tabs, the bottom bar tabs 3 over here. Cool. Now we have an ID for each of the tabs. Now we are having 3 tabs. Cool. For the first one is tab favorites, the second is tab nearby, while the third is tab friends. It can be anything, it can be any picture, it can be anything you want, but this is just for the example we used. Now this is the ID, or these are the IDs that you have to point out and you have to get on click of each of these tabs. So that's why we are using something similar to that. Right there in the tabs activity, we're pointing to the tab ID now. So if the tab ID is equals to the tab favorites, as we said, it's actually going to run the favorites fragment. Else, if the tab ID is equals to the tab nearby, it's going to run the nearby fragment. Else, definitely, if it's not any of the two, it's going to be for the friends. It's going to run the friends fragment rather. So we have that set up. These are all methods, private methods outside the onCreate method that is actually going to push you to the different fragments we're talking about. For the first fragment, which is the favorites, we have it set up this way. Now we need to call the fragment in question, called the 3 tabs fragment. We instantiate that and create an object called first fragment. In this, you need to get the support fragment manager and begin transaction. This is actually basically for the fragment version 4, not for the backward compatibility. You can also use that as well, but this is for the version 4 fragment. Very simple to actually replace fragments with this. You begin transaction and you replace based on the fragment frame, which is the ID we actually gave the frame. Let's get to look at that. We'll get to look at that right there in the layout. Right there in the fragment 3 tabs in the activity. Now let's get to look at what we're going to replace. We'll be replacing this frame layout, which has an ID of fragment frame. Can you see it right there in the display? This particular portion will be what this same tab will use, what this same nearby tab will use, and also friends tab will use. So on click of each one of these, the content right there in this container, which is the frame layout, will be replaced on runtime with different fragments. So that's just the essence of what I've been talking about. So we have this frame layout set up here, which takes an idea of fragment frame, which has space, all the space up above the bottom bar itself. So on click of this, we need changes on this particular content. So that's what we are actually talking about right there in the 3 tabs activity. So now it's actually going to replace the layout with an ID of fragment frame, which is the frame layout as we've seen, with the first fragment, and now there's an integer to specify which particular fragment in question, which we actually have a static int string here for the detail fragment, for the nearby fragment, and for the friends fragment. So we're actually going to know which fragment we are pointing to, and you have to commit to make that work. So that's for the favorite fragment. The same thing goes for the nearby fragment. You create a nearby fragment class, you instantiate that, and you replace. For the friends, you create a friends fragment, you replace that with the ID, which is the fragment frame. That same unique ID, that same frame layout will be replaced with 3 different contents on click of them, not at a time. So that's why we need the logic of the if else here for the tab selected. So if the tab ID selected at question is favorite, is going to run this. If not, it runs the second one or the third one. Now on tab select listener again. When you reselect, you can do different action, but we still want a coherent flow of display. That's why we need to also call the same if else statement on reselect of each tab. Run this fragment, the favorite, the nearby, and the friends fragment. So that's just simple. Now let's get to look at each detail of the fragments. I'll only be working vividly on one, which is where we are going to actually call the data using the cursor loader from the database, so that it's not going to block the UI thread, and we're going to actually use an adapter, and we're going to display the grids of fragrance right there in the favorites fragment. So we are going to have that displayed. In the other fragments, I'll only display just text for us to depict or see that contents are being changed dynamically right there in the fragment container. Now let's get to look at the 3 tabs fragment. Now in the 3 tabs fragment, we get to look at that right there. You need to extend the fragments class and implement the loader manager loader callback, passing the cursor of the database as a parameter. This is version 4. Loader manager, the same thing with the cursor. Now we're going to actually call from the database using the content provider. When you implement the loader manager, you need to override few methods. You need to override the onCreate loader, the onload finished, and the onloader reset, as you've seen right there. In the onCreate loader, you have the projection, which is the columns, ID, column name, description, image, price, user rating, and you need to return the new cursor loader, which is actually going to be a bunch of data. And firstly, you get the activity. You use get activity when you're talking about fragments, but when you are dealing with activity, you can point to this keyword. But when you use the fragment, you use the get activity to replace the this you use. And now we're pointing this to the content URI. We have the projection, which we've actually declared up there, and if you have a sort order, you pass it that as well. So on load finish, we need to swap the cursor to the fragrance adapter. This cursor is bunch of data coming from the database, so you have that set up. On an unloader reset, we pass null to the swap cursor. We'll get to look at the swap cursor right there in the fragrance adapter. Now right there in the views, we have the recycler view, we have the fragrance adapter, we have menu loader. This is actually going to trigger the loader, and we sometimes can use the SQLite database if we need to get access to the SQLite database straightforward. But with this, we are using the content provider, so we won't be accessing the SQLite database directly. Now let's get to look at how we get to initialize things. Instead of the onCreate, which we use in the activity, use the onCreate view. We can see how the onCreate as well created, but majorly you do all fast running actions right there in the onCreate view. This is where you get to inflate the fragment 3 tabs. Now this particular layout is specific to this fragment. You also have to create different layouts for different fragments. Now this is for the 3 tabs. If you are creating for the friends, you create this particular fragment layout. If you are creating for nearby, so that's just it, so that they're going to have a kind of separate and independent layout to use. So we have that created right there in the layout directory. We have the fragment 3 tabs, which has a recycler view and also the list item called the menu item. You have it set up using the card view, and we have the relative layout for the image view, which is the thumbs, and the text view for the name of the particular fragrance, and wrap around the relative layout, which actually wraps through the card view. So this is just a basic display of card grids. We've actually talked extensively on card grids and sort in previous tutorials. So we have that set up. Now we still head back to the 3 tabs fragment to talk more of how to actually use the fragment to display content from the SQLite database. On activity created, you have to override this. This is where we get to trigger the init loader, which is the loader to start up this particular content provider access to the database. where we call the get loader manager, initialize the loader, passing the menu loader integer, and this you can run this right there because this is actually overwriting on activity created, just mimicking the on activity you have right there in the activity class. So with this now, you can actually set up this. We only need the adapter to bind data because we've been able to pass this to the swap cursor. That is a method called swap cursor right there in the fragrance adapter. Let's get to quickly take a peep into the fragrance adapter. We have that right there in the fragrance adapter. This extends the recycler view adapter. Likewise, the fragrance adapter view order, which has an inner class called view order. This is where you can extend more on this adapter. Probably you want to add on click listener to this. You want to push further. You want to pass content using an intent further to a detailed activity. You actually do that right there. We talked extensively on how to create a detailed activities, and we have this fragrance adapter constructor that takes in the context and the cursor. This is where the instantiation of the fragrance adapter right there in the three tabs fragments is being called, where you pass in these two parameters, get activity and cursor, if you need to instantiate. On create view order, this calls on the menu item. We're just talking about that's where the card is, where we have the grid image view and also the text view for the title, and you have that set up. And on bind view order, after you might have passed the data cursor and you move to the position of the majorly to the first position, you start from there. In an array is always 0, index 0, you start from there. And we need to extract two things, the m name, which is the name of the fragrance, and the image URL. That's just what we need right there to be displayed. So for us to do that, you get a string, you call the data cursor to get the column index of the column name and also of the column image, the two. You can also get orders as well if you want to use them, and if you want to push their content right there with an intent. So you have for the column description, the column price, and also for the column user rating. And we are going to use glide because we're actually getting a link to let's say an external, or let's say a URL. We're getting the image from the URL, which is actually sitting right there in this cloud. So we need glide to dynamically load this content to our imagery. So we have that set up. So this is where we actually use glide to actually make that work. Now on swap cursor, this is where you get to pass in the cursor into this particular adapter, which will actually replace any old cursor and change with the new cursor. So very important as well. We have the get item if you want to actually use the get item to pick each position and pick the data and use the intent to actually pass the same data to the detailed activity. You can extend more on this if you want to add detailed activity to this, but we've been able to achieve the fragments, how to replace fragments, how to display content in each fragment. Now we've displayed content on a fragment called the favorite tab. Now let's get to look at other tabs that we actually had. We have for the nearby and friends. For us to actually get that, let's get to look at the nearby fragments. Cool. Just the same way you set up the onCreate view, you have to extend with the fragment, and the fragment you extend must be in the same version of the fragment that called it, which is the version 4. And we inflate with the nearby fragment. The nearby fragment also has a layout. This is the layout, the nearby layout, nearby fragment. Cool. This is just a text with a linear layout, with just a text with telling this is a nearby fragment. The same thing goes with the friends fragment. This is the friends fragment. So we just have that simple. So you can decide to also have complex, excuse me, complex data running, or probably you want to actually add some other functionality in different fragments. You can see it has its own layout, and it also has its own onCreate view, which you can use. So we've been able to achieve the extension of this fragment, this Bottombar library, and it's actually handy and useful. Out of the box, you can create a complex UI, and you can even use other forms of bottom bars. We've talked about the 3 tabs QR activity, the custom color fonts activity, the 5 color changing tabs, the badge activity, and so on. It's so much embedded, and this is just the starting block. And I've been able to show you on how to even use content provider, how to use database, SQLite database, how to fetch JSON data and parsing them appropriately, and how to also display them in a particular tab, which is not disturbing other tabs. You have other tabs with different content. Now we're going to just have a tab which is called the favorite tab, displaying the fragrance cards in grids. So we're actually going to be checking that out in a screencast, so that we'll be able to understand how this is actually going to look like. We'll get to look at the manifest. In the manifest, you need to register your provider, very important, with its authority. We should understand that by now. If you're using a content provider, you need to register that in your manifest, or else it's not going to actually run. And at the same time, what other activity do we use? We use the 3 tabs. No, cool. We are fine with that, because we've actually registered this 3 tabs activity right there. In the fragment is different from an activity. The fragment is actually living on the host, which is an activity. So, and it also has its own life cycle, just like the way an activity has its life cycle. A fragment sometimes is quite independent to an activity, but a fragment always needs an activity to run as well. A fragment lives on the host, so that's just it. And sometimes a host has his own life to live as well, just like what the fragment also depicts. So we have an extension and to Android application layouts if you really want to create complex UI. That's the sense of a fragment. And you can even also do this on different screen sizes as well, based on what you really wanted. If you want a master detail flow and so on, using this fragment approach. We've actually even created the larger screens. That's for the activated 3 tabs. If you notice, this for 600 dps and above. You'll notice we have the bottom bar right sitting just like a menu at the left corner. If you notice, look at it, it's sitting like a menu, not right there on the bottom anymore. So this is when you get to have larger screens. You can decide to make it look like a master detail flow and so on. So thank you guys, and don't forget to watch the screencast, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. We'll be there to always answer any of your questions, and also to bring top-notch quality and intuitive videos when it comes to Android development. Bye bye for now.